May 17, 1395. Picture this for a moment. You're standing in a swamp forest along the Audacious River, watching 40,000 Ottoman warriors spread across the horizon like a plague of locusts. Their banners darken the morning sky. The thunder of hooves from elite cavalry echoes off the hills. Sultan Bayezid the Thunderbolt himself commands this army, fresh from conquering half the Balkans. You command maybe 10,000 peasants, city troops, and light cavalry. The mathematics are simple, brutal, and final. For enemies for every one of your men. Yet in 12 hours, the most feared army in Europe will be broken. The Sultan who calls himself Lightning will flee in humiliation. And a 60-year-old Wallachian prince will achieve what no European ruler has managed in decades. He will make the unstoppable Ottoman Empire stop. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see medieval warfare forever. First, the audacious night infiltration that even modern special forces would call insane. Second, why Sultan Bayezid's legendary confidence became his fatal weakness. Third, the moment when Mircea the Elder disguised as a peasant monk walked into enemy camp and dared the Sultan to his face. But before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel uncovers the forgotten battles that shaped our world. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, here's what the chronicles don't tell you about that morning. This wasn't just another border skirmish. This was the battle that would determine whether Dracula ever existed. Whether the dragon would have a son. Whether the legends that haunt our nightmares would ever be born. Because the man commanding those 10,000 desperate Wallachians was Mircea the Elder. And 36 years later, his illegitimate son would father a child in Transylvania. A child who would grow up to become the most feared warrior in European history. A child whose name would echo through centuries. Dracula. Vlad the Impaler. But none of that happens if Mircea dies in the swamps of Rovine on this May morning in 1395. The odds against him aren't just steep. They're mathematically impossible. The year 1395 found the Ottoman Empire at the peak of its terrifying expansion. For 6 decades, Turkish armies had swept through the Balkans like an unstoppable tide, swallowing kingdoms the way wolves devoured sheep. Constantinople trembled behind ancient walls that grew thinner with each passing year. Serbia had fallen. Bulgaria had fallen. The great Byzantine Empire was reduced to a few coastal cities clinging to survival like shipwreck survivors to driftwood. At the heart of this Islamic hurricane stood Sultan Bayezid I, whose Turkish nickname Yildirim meant lightning. At 42 years old, he had earned that name through 6 years of campaigns so swift and brutal that his enemies often surrendered without fighting. Bayezid's reputation alone could empty fortresses. His mere approach caused entire armies to dissolve in panic. Here's what made Bayezid so terrifying in 1395. He didn't just conquer. He obliterated. When cities resisted, he didn't just take them. He erased them. His Janissary Corps, slave soldiers torn from Christian families as children and forged into perfect killing machines, formed the most professional infantry in the world. His Sipahi cavalry could cover 60 miles in a day, appearing where enemies thought safety lay. His tactics had crushed every Christian force he encountered for 6 consecutive years. The mathematics of Ottoman expansion were simple. Bayezid commanded an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, from the gates of Hungary to the deserts of Anatolia. His treasury overflowed with plunder from conquered cities. His armories could outfit 100,000 men. His generals had won more battles than most European kings had fought. Against this Islamic juggernaut stood Wallachia, a principality so small most Europeans couldn't find it on a map. Squeezed between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River, this land of forests and swamps had survived for decades through a combination of geography, desperation, and sheer stubbornness. Its ruler since 1386 had been Mircea, a prince who understood that survival required both courage and cunning in equal measure. But here's what made Mircea different from every other Christian ruler who had faced Ottoman expansion. He refused to accept that mathematics determined destiny. He refused to believe that 40,000 warriors must defeat 10,000. He refused to bow before the Sultan who called himself Lightning. And that refusal, that absolute rejection of the obvious, was about to change history. The road to Rovine began months earlier in the winter of 1394, when Ottoman scouts first probed Wallachia's southern border. These weren't the usual raiders testing defenses. These were professional soldiers conducting systematic reconnaissance, mapping river crossings, identifying supply routes, cataloging every detail that a major invasion would need. Mircea's intelligence network, a web of spies, merchants, and informants stretching from Constantinople to Buda, brought him reports that chilled even veteran commanders. The Sultan wasn't planning a punitive raid. He was preparing to eliminate Wallachia as an independent state. Ottoman workshops were forging siege equipment. Quartermasters were stockpiling grain for a summer campaign. Imperial decrees ordered vassal states to contribute troops. The message was clear. Bayezid had decided that the time for tributary relationships and diplomatic games had ended. Wallachia would either become an Ottoman province or it would cease to exist. Here's the strategic nightmare Mircea faced in early 1395. To his south lay the Ottoman Empire with resources that dwarfed anything Wallachia could muster. To his west lay Hungary, theoretically an ally but practically focused on its own power struggles and unwilling to risk confrontation with the Turks. To his east lay Moldavia, another Christian principality but one ruled by cousins who couldn't always be trusted. To his north lay only the Carpathian Mountains, beautiful but strategically useless. Wallachia was alone. The diplomatic situation was even worse than the military reality. In March 1395, Mircea had signed a treaty with King Sigismund of Hungary, creating a grand coalition against the Ottomans. On parchment, it looked impressive. In reality, it was meaningless. Sigismund's promises of military aid were worth exactly nothing when Ottoman armies actually appeared on Wallachian soil. The Hungarian king was too busy fighting his own nobles to spare troops for distant allies. The coalition existed only in diplomatic correspondence and Christian prayers. Mircea understood with crystalline clarity what this meant. When Bayezid came, and Bayezid would come, Wallachia would stand alone. The army Mircea could field reflected the principality's limited resources. His core military strength consisted of approximately 3,000 boyar cavalry, mounted nobles who owed military service in exchange for their lands. These weren't the mailed knights of Western Europe. They were light cavalry, skilled at hit-and-run tactics, deadly in ambush, but incapable of charging Ottoman formations head-on and surviving. Supporting the cavalry were perhaps 4,000 city militia and peasant levies. Craftsmen, farmers, and merchants who picked up spears and bows when their prince called. Some had fought before. Most hadn't. Their equipment ranged from professional to pathetic. Their training was measured in weeks, not years. Their courage would have to compensate for their inexperience. But here's where Mircea possessed one advantage that no amount of Ottoman gold could buy. His archers were legendary. Wallachian hunters who had grown up tracking deer through dense forests, whose grandfathers had taught them to loose 3 arrows while an enemy knocked one. These weren't the mounted archers of the steppe. These were woodland snipers who could hide in trees and pick off targets at 200 yards. In the right terrain, they were deadlier than any cavalry charge. The problem was finding the right terrain and forcing the Ottomans to fight there. As April turned to May, Ottoman columns began crossing the Danube. The invasion had begun. Not with dramatic declarations or formal challenges, but with a systematic occupation of southern Wallachia. Turkish cavalry swept across the plains, burning villages, driving refugees north, clearing a path for the main army that everyone knew was coming. On May 10, 1395, the hammer fell. Sultan Bayezid I personally led 40,000 warriors across the Danube at multiple crossing points. The numbers told the story of Wallachia's doom. 8,000 Sipahi heavy cavalry, mounted on Arabian horses worth more than a peasant's lifetime earnings, armored in mail and lamellar that could turn aside most arrows. 12,000 Turkish and Kurdish light cavalry, armed with composite bows that could punch through shields at 150 yards. 10,000 Azap infantry, light troops carrying spears and javelins. 5,000 Janissaries, the Sultan's household troops, professional soldiers who had never known defeat. And 5,000 irregulars, volunteers who had traveled from across the Islamic world for the chance to win glory and plunder fighting the infidel. But numbers only told part of the story. The real terror came from who led those 40,000 warriors. Bayezid commanded in person, bringing not just his military genius but his reputation. Riding beside him were some of the most famous warriors in the Balkans. Stefan Lazarevic, the Serbian despot, commanded 6,000 Serbian knights fighting as Ottoman vassals. Stefan was considered one of the finest cavalry commanders in Europe, a warrior whose personal courage was matched by his tactical skill. Prince Marko Mrnjavčević, hero of Serbian legend, led another contingent of Balkan Christians now serving the Sultan. Marko's father had been king of Serbia. His grandfather had fought the Ottomans when they first crossed into Europe. Now Marko fought for them, because the alternative was watching his people be destroyed. Konstantin Dejanovic brought his own force of Serbian magnates, warriors whose families had ruled the Balkans when the Ottomans were still fighting civil wars in Anatolia. Together, they represented not just military power but a psychological crushing of Christian resistance. If the greatest Christian warriors of the Balkans now fought for Islam, what hope did tiny Wallachia have? The Ottoman strategy was brutally simple. Bayezid would march north, crushing any resistance, until he reached Targovist, Wallachia's capital. The city would fall, Mircea would be captured or killed, and Wallachia would become an Ottoman province administered by a Turkish governor. The entire campaign was expected to last maybe 6 weeks. Conquering kingdoms had become routine for armies that had spent a generation doing exactly that. What Bayezid didn't understand, what his fame and success had blinded him to, was that Mircea wasn't planning to fight a conventional war. The old Wallachian prince had studied Ottoman tactics for a decade. He knew he couldn't win a pitched battle on open ground. The mathematics made that impossible. But mathematics assumed both armies fought on terrain where numbers mattered. What if there was terrain where 40,000 men became a liability instead of an advantage? The Rovine region, where the Argeș River curved through ancient forest and created a landscape of marshes, wooded ridges, and narrow valleys, offered exactly that terrain. Ottoman cavalry superiority meant nothing in swamps where horses sank to their knees. Turkish numerical advantage became irrelevant in forests where formations couldn't deploy. Bayezid's professional army would find itself fighting in conditions where experience counted less than knowledge of local geography. On May 14th, Mircea made his decision. He would not defend Targovist behind walls. He would not retreat into the mountains. He would not flee to Hungary begging for protection that would never come. Instead, he would lead his entire army south to Rovine and force the Sultan to fight on ground where Wallachian advantages could overcome Ottoman numbers. His commanders thought he had gone mad. The mathematics were impossible. The odds were suicide. But Mircea knew something they didn't. Sometimes courage changes mathematics. Sometimes audacity achieves what caution never could. Sometimes a 60-year-old prince who refuses to surrender can defeat an empire that has conquered half the known world. The march south began on May 15th, 10,000 Wallachians moving toward 40,000 Ottomans. The distance was only 30 miles, but it felt like marching toward the gates of hell itself. Now comes the part of the story that sounds like legend but appears in both Christian and Muslim sources. The night before the battle, Mircea did something so audacious that commanders still study it today as either the height of psychological warfare or absolute insanity. He disguised himself as a peace emissary, some sources say as an old monk, and walked directly into the Ottoman camp. Picture the scene that unfolded in Bayezid's magnificent silk pavilion on the evening of May 16th. The Sultan reclined on carpets worth a kingdom's ransom, surrounded by his commanders planning the next day's advance. Guards stood at attention, janissaries whose mere presence had caused Christian armies to break and run. Into this gathering walked an old man in simple robes, his face weathered by 60 years of Wallachian winters, claiming to be a peace envoy from Mircea's court. The guards let him pass because emissaries under flag of truce were protected by customs that even Bayezid respected. What happened next depends on which source you believe, but all agree on the essential facts. The old monk spoke in accented Turkish, addressing the Sultan with proper respect but without the groveling that vassals usually displayed. He carried a message from Prince Mircea. Wallachia humbly requested that the Sultan withdraw his forces. In exchange, safe passage back across the Danube would be guaranteed. No attacks. No harassment. Just peaceful departure and the promise to resolve disagreements through negotiation instead of war. The silence in that pavilion must have been profound. Bayezid's commanders couldn't believe what they were hearing. This tiny principality, this insignificant Christian backwater, was offering the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire safe passage to leave? The arrogance was breathtaking. The ignorance of reality was stunning. Several officers reached for their swords, ready to cut down this insolent fool who dared insult their lord. But Bayezid stopped them with a raised hand. The Sultan prided himself on his wit as much as his military prowess. This situation was too amusing to end with simple violence. He leaned forward, studying the old monk with eyes that had seen 1,000 battlefields, 1,000 enemies, 1,000 men who discovered too late that Ottoman power was not something you negotiated with. You submitted or you died. Here's what Bayezid said, according to Ottoman chroniclers who were probably trying to make their sultan look better than he actually did. He thanked the envoy for his concern. He praised Mircea's courage in sending such a message. Then he explained, patiently as a teacher to a foolish student, that Wallachia was already Ottoman soil. The only question was whether it would be absorbed peacefully or violently. The Sultan preferred peace. But peace required submission. Mircea could bow, pay tribute, acknowledge Ottoman suzerainty, and keep his throne. Or Mircea could fight and lose everything, his throne, his life, his principality's independence. The choice was his. The old monk listened to this explanation with the patience of someone who had heard similar speeches before. Then he did something that froze every warrior in that tent. He smiled. Not the nervous smile of a man realizing he had made a mistake. The smile of someone who knew a secret that everyone else in the room was too blind to see. According to legend, and this part appears in multiple sources though historians debate whether it actually happened, the old monk spoke one more time before departing. He said, roughly translated from medieval Turkish into modern English, the Sultan is welcome to try taking Wallachian soil. But he should remember that many men have drowned trying to swim in swamps they thought were shallow. Then he turned and walked out of the pavilion. Past the guards who should have stopped him. Past the janissaries who could have killed him with a gesture. Out of the Ottoman camp and into the darkness of the forest beyond. Some sources claim that only hours later did Bayezid's spies confirm what the Sultan had already suspected. The old monk wasn't an envoy. He was Mircea himself. The Prince of Wallachia had walked into the heart of an army that wanted to destroy him, delivered his message personally, and escaped without anyone realizing until he was long gone. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Turkish commanders who had been confident of easy victories suddenly felt doubt creeping into their calculations. If Mircea was bold enough to infiltrate their camp, what else was he capable of? If he showed no fear facing 40,000 warriors, what did he know that they didn't? But Bayezid's reaction was fury mixed with determination. The old prince had insulted him personally, had questioned his power, had treated the Ottoman Empire like it was some minor kingdom that could be warned away with threats. This was no longer just about conquering Wallachia. This was about proving that no Christian prince, no matter how clever or brave, could mock the Sultan and survive. The invasion would continue. The battle would happen. And Mircea would learn that courage alone couldn't overcome the mathematics of war. The night passed with both armies preparing for what everyone knew would come. The Ottomans sharpened weapons, checked armor, and recited prayers asking Allah to grant them victory over the infidels. The Wallachians did the same, except their prayers went to a different god and their preparations included detailed discussions of the terrain they knew intimately and the Ottomans had never seen. May 17, 1395, dawned with fog rolling off the Audacious River, shrouding the Rovine region in mist that seemed supernatural in its timing. Sultan Bayezid emerged from his pavilion expecting a clear morning for military operations. Instead he faced visibility measured in yards instead of miles. The fog would burn off by mid-morning. Everyone knew that, but it gave Mircea's forces time to complete their positioning in the swampy forest that would become a killing ground. The Ottoman army began its advance at first light, or what passed for first light in the fog-shrouded valley. 40,000 warriors moving in organized columns, their discipline evident even through the mist. Light cavalry scouted ahead. Heavy cavalry formed the center. Infantry marched in blocks that could deploy into battle lines with practiced efficiency. The janissaries surrounded the Sultan's position, ready to protect their lord or exploit any enemy weakness. Everything by the book. Everything professional. Everything designed to crush resistance through overwhelming force and superior tactics. Then the advance columns entered the Rovine swamp, and the book started burning. The terrain that Wallachian scouts had mapped for weeks revealed itself as a nightmare for conventional armies. What looked like solid ground from a distance turned into mud that grabbed horses' hooves. What appeared to be clear paths led into dead ends bordered by impenetrable thornbush. The river that seemed fordable in multiple places had exactly 3 crossings, all of them easily defended. And everywhere, trees crowded close enough that cavalry formations couldn't deploy. The Ottoman vanguard discovered these facts through brutal experience. Sipahi heavy cavalry, invincible on open ground, found their expensive horses struggling in knee-deep mud. When they tried to charge up slopes toward Wallachian positions, their mounts slipped on wet leaves and loose soil. The elite warriors who had swept across Balkan plains like death itself became targets rather than threats. That's when the arrows started falling. Wallachian archers, positioned in trees and behind fallen logs, began loosing shafts with methodical precision. Not massed volleys intended to break formations. Surgical strikes aimed at individual targets. Officers fell first, identified by their better armor and position at the front of columns. Then horses, because a mounted warrior whose horse was killed became infantry, and infantry was useless in this terrain. Then anyone who tried to give orders or organize a response. The Ottoman casualties weren't massive at this stage. Maybe 300 men in the first hour. But the psychological impact was devastating. The army that had conquered kingdoms couldn't see its enemies, couldn't close with them, couldn't use its superior numbers because the terrain prevented massing forces. Every arrow that found its mark came from an invisible archer who vanished into the forest before retaliation was possible. Bayezid, receiving reports from increasingly frustrated commanders, made his first major tactical decision. He would force the Wallachians to fight a real battle. He sent Stefan Lazarevic's Serbian cavalry, 6,000 strong, to flank the Wallachian position. The Serbs knew this kind of terrain. They had fought in Balkan forests and mountains. They would find a way around the swamps and catch Mircea's forces from an unexpected direction. The plan was sound. The execution was where it fell apart. Stefan's cavalry rode for 3 hours trying to find a path through the swamps. They discovered what Mircea had known all along. There was no way around. The geography created a natural funnel, and the Wallachians sat at the narrow end where defenders had every advantage. When Stefan's forces finally attempted a frontal assault through the only clear approach, they rode directly into a prepared killing zone. Wallachian archers positioned on elevated ground rained arrows down on cavalry that couldn't maneuver in the confined space. Stefan himself showed magnificent courage, leading charge after charge trying to break through the Wallachian lines. According to both Christian and Muslim accounts, the Serbian despot fought like a hero from ancient legends, his sword never still, his voice never silent as he urged his men forward. But courage and leadership couldn't change geography. The narrow approaches prevented Serbian numbers from overwhelming Wallachian positions. Every charge died in a storm of arrows and spear thrusts. After 2 hours of this futility, Stefan withdrew what remained of his force. He had lost perhaps 800 men and achieved exactly nothing except proving that Mircea's defensive position was even stronger than the Sultan had feared. But not everyone survived that bloody morning. Prince Marko Mrnjavčević, the legendary Serbian warrior, fell during one of the charges. Ottoman sources claim he died gloriously, fighting to the last breath. Wallachian chronicles suggest he may have been caught in the swamp, unable to escape when Mircea's infantry counterattacked. Either way, one of the most famous knights in the Balkans lay dead in Romanian mud, his legendary sword beside him, his dreams of Serbian glory extinguished in a forest far from home. Constantine Dejanovic also fell in the same engagement. Two of the greatest Christian warriors fighting for the Ottoman Empire, both dead before noon. The psychological impact rippled through Bayezid's army. If warriors like Stefan and Marco couldn't break the Wallachian position, who could? By midday, the Sultan faced a crisis that his 6 years of victories had never prepared him for. His army was stalled. His flanking maneuvers had failed. His casualties were mounting steadily. And the fog that had lifted by late morning revealed a tactical situation that made experienced commanders nervous. The Ottomans were stretched along 3 miles of swampy forest, their formations broken by terrain, their communications hampered by the same trees that sheltered Wallachian archers. If Mircea counterattacked now, the battle could turn from stalemate into disaster. Bayezid's response showed why he had earned his reputation. He pulled his scattered forces back to defensible positions and ordered his janissaries to establish a fortified camp. These elite infantry, the best soldiers in the Ottoman army, formed a defensive perimeter that was essentially impenetrable. Wooden stakes were driven into the ground. Shields were interlocked. Every approach was covered by disciplined troops who knew how to kill anyone who came close. This tactical innovation, creating a fortress in the middle of an active battlefield, was something European armies had never seen before. It would be used again at the Battle of Nicopolis the following year. It was brilliant, professional, and exactly what Bayezid needed to prevent catastrophic defeat. The problem was that it transformed the battle from an Ottoman victory march into a defensive fight for survival. For Mircea, this was the critical moment. His strategy had worked brilliantly. He had negated Ottoman numerical superiority through terrain selection. He had inflicted significant casualties while losing relatively few of his own men. He had proven that the unstoppable Ottoman army could be stopped. But he couldn't break the Janissary defensive camp without suffering casualties his small army couldn't afford. The afternoon of May 17th saw a different kind of warfare. Wallachian forces probed the Ottoman perimeter, testing for weaknesses. Turkish defenders killed any attacker who came too close. Arrows fell on both sides. Men died in small skirmishes that achieved nothing except adding to the casualty count. As sunset approached, both armies faced the same realization. Neither could destroy the other. The Ottomans couldn't advance through terrain that favored defenders. The Wallachians couldn't assault prepared positions defended by professional soldiers. Mircea had achieved something remarkable. He had fought the Sultan to a standstill. But standstill wasn't victory, and both commanders knew that the strategic situation favored whoever could wait longer. The night of May 17th brought war councils in both camps. Bayezid's commanders argued for withdrawal. They had achieved nothing. They had suffered embarrassing casualties. They had proven that Wallachia couldn't be conquered easily. Better to retreat in good order, claim a strategic victory because technically the Ottomans still held their positions, and plan a larger campaign for next year with better preparation and more forces. But the Sultan's pride wouldn't allow that admission of failure. He had brought 40,000 men to conquer a principality. He had promised his followers easy victory and rich plunder. He had personally threatened Mircea with destruction. Retreating after a single day of inconclusive fighting would make him look weak. Would encourage other Christian princes to resist. Would crack the aura of invincibility that had made Ottoman expansion so psychologically devastating. So Bayezid made the decision that would define the battle's outcome. His army would hold its position for several more days. If the Wallachians attacked, the Janissaries would destroy them. If the Wallachians withdrew, the Ottomans would claim victory by default. Either way, the Sultan would not retreat first. Mircea's council faced different calculations. His army had performed magnificently. His casualties were light. His defensive position remained strong. But he couldn't sustain this standoff indefinitely. His supplies were limited. His men were exhausted from days of marching and fighting. And most importantly, Bayezid could call for reinforcements from across his vast empire. Mircea's 10,000 were all Wallachia could field. There were no reserves. No reinforcements. No backup plan if something went wrong. The Wallachian prince made his own decision. His army would launch one final series of attacks against the Ottoman camp. If they succeeded in breaking through, the battle would become a rout. If they failed, they would withdraw under cover of darkness before the Ottomans could organize pursuit. It was calculated gambling, the kind of decision that separates great commanders from merely competent ones. Over the next 2 days, fighting raged across the Rovine swamps with an intensity that horrified participants on both sides. Wallachian infantry charged the Janissary lines repeatedly, trying to find weak points in the defensive perimeter. Ottoman soldiers held firm, their discipline absolute, their casualties mounting but their formation never breaking. The death toll climbed into the thousands. Archers on both sides ran out of arrows and resorted to salvaging shafts from corpses. The wounded crawled to the rear where physicians did what they could with medieval medicine's limited tools. The forests around Rovine became charnel houses where the dead outnumbered the living. According to various sources, total casualties for the entire 3-day engagement ranged from 4,000 to 7,000 dead on both sides. The Ottomans lost more in absolute numbers because they had more men exposed to Wallachian arrows. But proportionally, Mircea's losses hurt more. Every dead Wallachian represented a percentage of his total force that couldn't be replaced. By May 19th, both armies were exhausted and both commanders knew that continuing the battle served no purpose. That night, under cover of darkness and a return of the morning fog, both armies began withdrawing from the battlefield. The Wallachians melted into the forests they knew so well, moving north toward defensible positions in the mountains. The Ottomans marched south toward the Danube, their formations still intact, their pride wounded but their professional competence undimmed. When dawn broke on May 20th, the Rovine swamps were empty except for the dead and the scavengers who came to feed on them. No victory parade. No formal surrender. No triumphant entry into captured cities. Just two armies that had fought each other to exhaustion and decided that surviving was preferable to dying for unclear strategic goals. So who won the Battle of Rovine? The answer depends on who you ask and what you measure. Ottoman chronicles claim Sultan Bayezid achieved his objectives. He had invaded Wallachia. He had inflicted casualties on Christian forces. He had proven Ottoman power could reach anywhere in the Balkans. The fact that he withdrew was merely tactical prudence, not defeat. His honor remained intact. His reputation survived. Wallachian sources tell a different story. Mircea had faced the most powerful army in Europe and survived. He had protected his principality from conquest. He had killed legendary Ottoman vassals like Prince Marko. Most importantly, he had forced the Sultan who called himself Lightning to retreat without achieving his primary objective. Wallachia remained independent. For a tiny principality facing an empire, that was victory enough. Modern historians generally agree on several key facts. First, the battle was tactically inconclusive but strategically favorable to Wallachia. The Ottomans failed to conquer the principality, which was their stated goal. Second, Mircea's tactical use of terrain to negate numerical superiority became a case study in defensive warfare. Third, the psychological impact was significant. Other Balkan princes saw that Ottoman armies could be resisted successfully if commanders chose their ground carefully and refused to fight conventional battles on terrain that favored Turkish tactics. But here's the legacy that matters more than casualty counts or strategic analyses. Mircea the Elder survived the Battle of Rovine. He continued ruling Wallachia for another 23 years, dying peacefully in 1418 at the age of 63. During those years, he maintained his principality's independence through a combination of tribute payments, diplomatic maneuvering, and occasional military resistance when necessary. He never became an Ottoman vassal in the full sense. He never surrendered his autonomy. He never stopped being the prince who had faced Bayezid and lived to tell about it. And because Mircea survived, his son Vlad Dracula was born around 1395, possibly in the year of the battle itself. Vlad Dracula grew up hearing stories about his father's courage. About the old prince who had walked into Ottoman camp and dared the Sultan. About the battle where 10,000 Wallachians fought 40,000 Turks and survived. Those stories shaped Vlad Dracula's understanding of power, courage, and what was necessary to maintain Wallachian independence. In 1431, Vlad Dracula fathered his own son in the Transylvanian city of Sighisoara. That child grew up in his grandfather's shadow, hearing legends of Mircea the Elder's defiance, learning that sometimes courage matters more than mathematics, understanding that survival against overwhelming odds requires both tactical brilliance and absolute refusal to surrender. That child was Vlad III, who would become known to history as Vlad Vlad the Impaler, the man whose resistance against the Ottoman Empire would become legendary, the warrior whose name would inspire terror for centuries, the prince whose reputation would eventually transform into the vampire legend we know as Dracula. None of that happens without Rovine. If Mircea falls in those swamps in May 1395, his bloodline ends. The Draculesti line never exists. The Order of the Dragon never recruits Vlad Dracul. The castle in Transylvania never becomes associated with a warrior so fierce that his enemies created supernatural legends to explain his deadliness. The entire mythology of Dracula traces its roots back to a 60-year-old prince who refused to surrender in a swamp forest where every rational calculation said he should die. Think about the chain of events. Mircea survives Rovine in 1395. Vlad Dracul is born shortly after. Vlad Dracul joins the Order of the Dragon in 1431, earning the nickname Dracul the Dragon. Vlad III inherits that nickname, becoming Dracula, son of the dragon. Vlad III's resistance against Mem II creates legends of supernatural ferocity. Those legends merge with vampire folklore. Bram Stoker hears those legends and writes a novel in 1897. That novel creates the modern vampire myth that dominates popular culture 130 years later. Every step in that chain depends on Mircea surviving one battle in 1395. One battle where the mathematics said he couldn't win. One battle where courage changed history. But the Battle of Rovine's significance extends beyond family trees and vampire legends. It represents a crucial moment in European resistance to Ottoman expansion. Before Rovine, Christian forces had been defeated so consistently that surrender seemed inevitable. Serbian princes had become Ottoman vassals. Bulgarian tsars had submitted. Byzantine emperors paid tribute. The psychological momentum favored Islam, and momentum in warfare often matters more than tactics. After Rovine, that momentum cracked. Not broken entirely, the Ottomans would continue expanding for another century. But cracked enough that other Christian princes saw resistance was possible. That proper terrain selection could overcome numerical disadvantages. That Ottoman armies, for all their professionalism and power, weren't invincible if opponents refused to fight on Turkish terms. The Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, just 1 year after Rovine, saw a massive Crusader army attempt to stop Ottoman expansion. They failed catastrophically because they fought the kind of conventional battle on open ground where Ottoman tactics dominated. But the fact that the crusade happened at all, that Western European knights traveled to the Balkans to fight the Ottomans, was partly inspired by Mircea's example at Rovine. If a tiny principality could resist, perhaps a combined Christian force could drive the Turks back entirely. The dream failed at Nicopolis. But the dream existed because of Rovine. 50 years later, John Hunyadi would use terrain tactics similar to Mircea's to defeat Ottoman forces in Transylvania. 70 years after Rovine, Vlad the Impaler would employ psychological warfare and defensive positioning to resist Mehmed the Conqueror. The tactics pioneered at Rovine echoed through generations of Balkan warfare. Every small principality that survived Ottoman expansion borrowed something from Mircea's playbook. Use geography. Avoid conventional battles. Strike from unexpected directions. Make conquest so expensive that even winning becomes losing. These principles, tested at Rovine in 1395, sustained Christian resistance in the Balkans for another century. Today, the exact location of the Battle of Rovine is disputed. The marshes have been drained. The forests have been cleared. The landscape where 10,000 Wallachians faced 40,000 Ottomans has been transformed by 600 years of agriculture and development. But the lessons remain as sharp as the arrows that filled the sky on May 17, 1395. Mircea the Elder proved something that modern militaries still teach at staff colleges from West Point to Sandhurst. Superior numbers mean nothing without superior positioning. Overwhelming force becomes irrelevant when the terrain negates its deployment. professional armies can be defeated by determined defenders who understand that survival sometimes requires rejecting every conventional rule of warfare. The mathematical impossibility of 10,000 defeating 40,000 dissolved in swamps where cavalry couldn't charge and infantry couldn't mass. Here's what makes Rovine eternally relevant. In our age of technology and precision weapons, we assume that military superiority is something you can calculate with spreadsheets and computer models. But Mircea understood what algorithms still can't grasp. Human will changes mathematics. Courage transforms impossible odds into survivable challenges. Leadership creates opportunities that no tactical manual predicts. When a 60-year-old prince walks into an enemy camp with 40,000 warriors and delivers a warning to the Sultan's face, mathematics stops being the deciding factor. Psychology takes over. The Battle of Rovine teaches us that the greatest victories emerge not from superior resources but from superior thinking applied at the moment when everyone else has accepted defeat. Mircea was supposed to die in those swamps. His principality was supposed to become an Ottoman province. His bloodline was supposed to end with him. Instead, he chose to reign over tradition, cunning over courage, survival over glory. And because of that choice made in a moment of desperate calculation, Dracula exists. Not just the historical Vlad III who terrorized Ottoman armies, but the entire mythology that his resistance created. Every vampire story, every gothic horror, every nightmare about the undead traces its ancestry back to a battle where a grandfather refused to let mathematics determine his grandson's fate. Think about the chain of causation one more time. Without Rovine, no Mircea bloodline. Without the bloodline, no Vlad Dracula. Without Vlad Dracula, no Vlad the Impaler. Without the Impaler, no legends of supernatural warriors. Without those legends, Bram Stoker writes about something else entirely. Without Stoker's novel, modern vampire mythology develops completely differently. Every movie, every TV show, every book about vampires owes its existence to a Wallachian prince who understood that sometimes the only way to win is to change the rules entirely. The Battle of Rovine stands as proof that impossible odds become possible when tactical innovation meets absolute refusal to surrender. That numerical superiority yields to geographical advantage when commanders possess the courage to fight on their own terms. That empires can be stopped by princes who understand that survival is victory when facing enemies who expected annihilation. On May 17, 1395, Mircea the Elder looked at 40,000 Ottoman warriors and decided that mathematics had no authority over destiny. He chose swamp over surrender, ambush over assault, patience over panic. In doing so, he saved not just his principality but his legacy, ensuring that his grandson would inherit a tradition of resistance that would echo through centuries. Sultan Bayezid the Thunderbolt returned to his capital claiming victory. But he never again personally invaded Wallachia. The principality he thought would fall in weeks remained independent for decades. The old prince he threatened with destruction died peacefully in his bed 23 years later, surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that he had achieved something rarer than conquest. He had survived when survival seemed impossible. In war as in life, sometimes the greatest triumph is not destroying your enemy but refusing to let your enemy destroy you. Mircea understood this with crystalline clarity on that foggy May morning when he positioned his army in terrain where Ottoman power became Ottoman weakness. The lesson resonates across 6 centuries. Mathematics determines many things, but not destiny. Numbers predict many outcomes, but not all of them. And sometimes, just sometimes, a 60-year-old prince with 10,000 desperate men can defeat an empire with 40,000 professional soldiers, not by being stronger, but by being smarter, more determined, and absolutely unwilling to accept that defeat was inevitable. The swamps of Rovine have dried up. The warriors who fought there are dust. But the principle they demonstrated remains as vital as the blood that soaked into Romanian soil on May 17, 1395. When courage meets cunning in terrain that negates enemy advantages, impossible becomes inevitable. When leadership refuses to accept mathematical certainty, destiny rewrites itself. When princes choose survival over glory, legends are born that outlast empires. Mircea the Elder, Dracula's grandfather, proved all of this in 3 days of desperate fighting that changed European history. He proved that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones where you don't win, you just refuse to lose. And in refusing to lose, you create space for futures that would never have existed if you had accepted the mathematics of annihilation. That's the real legacy of Rovine. Not casualty counts or territorial changes, but the demonstration that human will can overcome mathematical certainty when applied with precision, courage, and absolute conviction that the impossible is just another problem waiting for the right solution. If this story of impossible odds and legendary courage moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that mathematics doesn't determine destiny. Subscribe if you want more forgotten battles that changed history. And drop a comment telling me which impossible victory you want covered next. Because history is filled with moments when outnumbered, outgunned forces refused to surrender and changed the world. Rovine is just one example. There are dozens more waiting to be told. This is the power of human determination documented in blood and mud. This is what happens when courage rewrites mathematics. This is Mircea the Elder's gift to his grandson and to everyone who ever faced impossible odds and decided to fight anyway. The vampires are fiction. But the courage that inspired them? That was real. And it started in a swamp forest on May 17, 1395, when Dracula's grandfather looked at 40,000 enemies and decided that numbers had no authority over destiny.